Everybody knows that consciousness is deeply tangled or entangled with a lot of these other topics and concepts, quantum phenomena, randomness, psi, causality, free will, and it's one big tangled mess. And I don't claim to be able to untangle all of that, but at least we need to be constantly aware of how complex the problem is that we're dealing with. It leads all of us, myself included, into lots of confusions about common concepts. And so, unfortunately, what seems to end up happening is a lot of the discussion is a word salad taken from this slide, and there's not nearly as much clarity as there needs to be for good traction, I think. How is consciousness like Las Vegas? Well, it looks very different to different visitors. It's exciting and attractive. It's filled with bright lights and promise of great rewards. It seems like there's a lot of neon around the concept of consciousness, and people see it as somehow very attractive, very central to the whole problem of how the human being functions and how our interactions with the world and how these phenomena take place and so on. And I'm just suggesting that we're putting a little too much emphasis on this in some cases. So this is neon lights in Las Vegas, but it's strangely unsatisfying after a while and often leaves you a bit poorer than before. I think our focus is somewhat misplaced, or emphasis is misplaced somewhat, and of course whatever happens there stays there. Okay, so the first thing that gives me a rash is people don't define what they're talking about with respect to consciousness, and this is all pervasive, really. There's so many different definitions of consciousness. Do you have it when you're asleep? Does it require self-awareness? Do you have it in a coma? Does an animal have it? Are you talking really about mind or about soul or about the self-identity? Or as some people say, Christoph Koch says, it's basically the ability to discriminate and integrate information from the sensory inputs. This author, Vimal, listed greater than 40 definitions in the Journal of Consciousness, the Journal of Consciousness Studies a couple of years ago, and talks that I've heard here so far with my admittedly biased viewpoint on this that had consciousness in their main subject content. 8 of them, and none of them really defined what their meaning for consciousness was and what the concept meant in terms of their content. So from this you get a lot of pessimism about consciousness. People who are highly respected, intelligent, knowledgeable, and certainly well-meaning say things like physics has to be replaced by new laws and there's something fundamentally missing, and nobody has the faintest idea what consciousness is, and the slightest idea how anything material could be conscious. Sorry, I'm just not buying all that, and I think we already know quite a bit about consciousness in the naive sense, about it, how it works in the brain, and we know something more than is commonly recognized, as I'll try to say, about how conscious functioning in the human brain brings about phenomena that we think of as anomalous or so strange that consciousness must be something special. So I think that these comments are just not justified. Hawking says the brain's a computer, but there's no afterlife. So I'll go along with the first. The brain's pretty much a computer, but there's more to it than we think. And certainly he's not acknowledging the evidence for survival and reincarnation and so forth, which I happen to think is pretty strong. So there's a real mixed bag there. We might classify the phenomenon surrounding and connected to consciousness in 4 levels, starting out with Chalmers' easy and hard problems. The hard problem being how do we have experiences or an inner life or a sense of self and so on. And the extraordinary phenomenon that people tend to get excited about, which included ESP and various psychic phenomena. And then, of course, there are beyond extraordinary experiences that many people in this group are familiar with and take seriously: reincarnation, hauntings, medium communication, and so forth. These are not only obviously challenging in the extreme, they also have the potential benefit of a lot of interesting hints and information about how the rest of it all works, including the simpler aspects of consciousness. And so I think we shouldn't shy away from those. Given that viewpoint, what does physics have to say about this, and what's our opinion of it? Well, these are kind of options that I hear from time to time. Physics is deeply wrong. We're going to have to rewrite it completely with new principles, new center focus, foci or something. It's incomplete. Some tweaks are necessary, or maybe just a new point of view, what we have, or of course the extreme view that it's all correct and everything else is just a hallucination. I come down somewhere in the middle here, and I'll show a little bit of why I think some tweaks will make it much more powerful with respect to these interesting phenomena than most people would think at this point. Unfortunately, though, this leads to lots of misunderstandings about quantum mechanics, and it's a screwy subject, and it contradicts common sense typically. But what needs to change is our idea of common sense, not our interpretations of the physics. And I don't mean we have to cancel common sense and start over or anything. We just need to tweak our common sense a little bit. So people often say that superposition means that something can take two paths at once, and the particle goes through both slits and that sort of thing. Well, that's not true. The particle does not go through both slits, and half particles do not go through both slits. And semi-transparent phantasms of two particles do not go through two slits. Like I think York was saying, what goes through the two slits are the possibility of a particle goes through both slits. When it gets to the screen at the end, it ends up at one place. The single particle only hits the screen at one place. There may be an interference pattern, but what's interfering is possibilities. And the whole message of quantum mechanics, if you want to look at it this way, is that possibilities must be taken seriously. Possibilities matter. Similarly, measurement implies that observation creates reality. Nothing's real. The moon isn't there until we look. It's just simply not true. Knowledge collapses a wave function, and human knowledge or a conscious observer collapses a wave function. Not so. Quantum mechanics says that an irreversible amplification of a microscopic quantum measurement to the macroscopic realm is what constitutes a collapse of the wave function. It is the collapse. It's not something that causes the collapse. It is the collapse. Same thing, or equivalently, a recording of some quantum measurement, a permanent recording of that measurement collapses the wave function. Spooky action at a distance, this is what Einstein vociferously objected to for many years, of course. It's not true that entanglement enables spooky action at a distance. What it does enable is spooky correlation at a distance. And again, this is an important difference. Distant communication instantly, it's just not true. You can't actually communicate with entanglement, but as I'll show in a minute, you can make it look like that. Entanglement enables sending a message back in time. No, you can't send a message back in time. Actually, you can send a message back in time, you just can't read it there. This is really the way it works out. Henry Stapp, for whom I have a lot of respect and affection, says quantum mechanics is about consciousness. Quantum mechanics needs consciousness by virtue of its intrinsic structure. Sorry, I just don't think that's correct. And I listen to Henry a lot because he says things that I don't agree with, and you should always listen to your opponents. Anthony Leggett, here are two more really sensible statements. Anthony Leggett says it may be somewhat dangerous to explain something one does not understand very well by invoking something that one does not understand at all. And so on. Let's go on to psi phenomena and a little bit of physics. People know that there are some phenomena where conscious intention seems to have an effect in the world. Here's the entangled situation where we create an entangled pair, send them off. Each one is a superposition. That means there's two possibilities, 0 and 1 in this case. And they don't get determined until we measure. And when we measure them, each of them appears random, totally random. But they're the same. That's because of the entanglement. But the way to look at this is that the measurement determined something that was less than fully determined in the first place. It was under constraint. It could have been either 0 or 1. What happened at the measurement in the future caused the thing to be whatever it was in the first place, namely 0 or 1. And thus, the other one had to agree. So now if we take a look at a Psi experiment that's very similar but flipped in time, so the interaction is in the future. This is just like the BEM experiment. There isn't any information that flows directly back and forth as far as we can tell. Instead, there's a correlation being created by a bias from the future, by the bias of the experimenter, not what he thinks or what his unconscious thinks, but what he actually does in the world, how he conditions the future. If you condition the future to accept more easily lots of hits, you'll get more hits by virtue of this correlation. It looks exactly like it's information transfer, in this case backwards from the future to the past, but it's just an effect of the correlation. Okay, spinning ahead. Please don't tell us some of these things. Consciousness is required in quantum mechanics, and psi phenomena deny materialism and so forth. It's just, it's making unwarranted assumptions or leaps. But of course, there are some phenomena that people here are familiar with, many of us are familiar with, and I'm preaching to the choir a bit. These are really interesting. Obviously, psychometry and reincarnation and haunting would indicate or suggest some kind of imprinting of personality and memories and consciousness, and even physical characteristics like birthmarks and scars. So there's something terribly interesting going on here, and at least in principle is separable, if not separate, from the physical brain. So these are really things that interest me the most, strongly indicated. Study is strongly indicated. So the focus ought to be on these more careful definitions and understanding of physics, research on the physics of psi phenomena, just not the psychology alone of psi phenomena. And we have to be willing to confront these challenging phenomena from an externalized, feet-on-the-ground scientific viewpoint and build bridges to mainstream science much more than is often being done today, rather than insisting upon large replacements of whatever's going on in mainstream science, or insertion of consciousness into the foundations, for example, of physics like matter and energy. I just don't think that's at all warranted. Consciousness, at least at the highest level, can be thought of as a form of a feedback loop or a set of very complex feedback self-referring loops. And this is where identity begins to form and the fundamental brain rhythms begin to form as through these large-scale, very complex loops. And we know a fair amount about that. It certainly doesn't explain the whole story. But we're getting there. And if you don't think an artificial system could have the same connectivity, topology, memory structure, and so forth, and then for some reason it wouldn't be conscious, it wouldn't have experiences, then I would say the burden is with you to explain why that would be different. Okay, repeating what I said, basically some phenomena do suggest this separateness. And I want to make one more point about the progress of science. To me, it's all about, the history of science is all about relinquishing in different steps our specialness in the world. We used to think that the Earth was the center of everything. You just look up and you see the stars and the sun and all that going over. We must be at the center. Not true, of course. We used to think that all these elements, as we understood them, were special, but turned out they're all made out of much smaller items which are all identical. Motion states, we used to think there's a special rest state or coordinate system in the world. Gradually, everything that we tended to believe in associated with us in some way has been removed by a simpler and more elegant theory. Life, there's no magic elan, vital, and so on. So to me, the logical extension, the next step, or one of the next steps we need to take along this path is I am not special. My consciousness, my egocentric view of everything which each of us has is not special. It's not important. It's interesting. It has important interactions and implications in the world, but it's not the thing that we should have at the center of our viewpoint or our activities in science. Stephen Jay Gould said it better than anyone. The most important scientific revolutions all include, as their only common feature, the dethronement of human arrogance from one pedestal after another of previous convictions about our centrality in the cosmos. I really like that a lot. Okay, well, I think I'm done. Thank you.
We do have time for questions.
Dick, I agree with your general viewpoint that we need to clarify our definitions, and we have invoked a lot of fuzzy concepts in what we're doing. But I disagree with your having taken one particular perspective on quantum mechanics as if that were the only one. Because still quantum mechanics is poorly understood. It gives results, but it doesn't give reasons or mechanisms. In particular, the von Neumann perspective on quantum mechanics essentially says that the buck stops with consciousness, and that's all. Whereas you said, for example...
You're right, we don't agree.
That if you have a phenomenon which you then record in a permanent recording medium, such as a tape or computer memory or something like that, at that point you've collapsed the wave function. On the other hand, there are concepts and evidence that that's not true. One piece of evidence is the famous Helmut Schmidt experiments in which he recorded information.
It looks like you can always uncollapse and erase.
Let me just finish this. And the next day he then modified the information that was recorded through some sort of interaction. And we just don't know. We just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You're right, we disagree. There's the quantum eraser experiments you know about, I'm sure, and there's various evidence that nothing's really permanent. You can create a loop, which is a memory element, and then it feeds on itself. You don't need the source any longer. Maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. We ought to explore these things more fully. Von Neumann's consciousness was his interest in consciousness as the ultimate endpoint might be true or a valid viewpoint from the point of view that for you it ends there. But that doesn't mean that in the world in general that it's necessarily the end point or the right thing to focus on. So to me, that was one of those neon streets in Las Vegas that he went down, and it turned out to be a dead end or end in a casino or something. That wasn't satisfying to me, except for the more or less trivial explanation that it's true for me when it gets to me. The Helmut Schmidt experiments? Yeah. Well, as I say, it may be possible to go back and change the past, but really what this theory says is that you can't change the past. What you can do is change the way it turned out in the first place. I really shouldn't even say that. You can influence the way it turned out in the first place. That's the message of EPR. In effect, you started out with these two entangled particles, each of which was a superposition, but by measuring one of them, you determined the other backwards in time and then forward again. This is like the Costa-Beauregard zigzag interpretation. So a generalization of that same idea says to me that something that happens in the future can have an influence on a random, in particular a randomly sourced device or set of data in the past by, in effect, deciding how it turned out in the first place when it was under constraint. That's what a random number generator does, is under constrain things. It's really ironic that the thing that we use to separate our experiments from the past is exactly that which allows us to affect the past from the future. So that's how I'd explain those experiments. I hope that was at least semi-intelligible.
We have one more yes-no question.
Thanks. Very interesting presentation. Just to clarify your position, in your reading of the mainstream quantum mechanics, is local realism empirically disproven, yes or no?
Both locality and realism? I'd have to say yes, but I'm not sure the matter is completely settled, at least for me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.